In January 2026, Maria received a knock on her door. She'd lived in the United States for 34 years. She had paid taxes every year. She had a job, a family, a home. She also had something else, a piece of paper from 1992 saying her entry documents weren't quite in order. That paper had been sitting in a filing cabinet for over 3 decades. Nobody cared about it until now. "I followed the law," she told reporters before being deported. But officials said she also broke it. How is that possible? The answer isn't about whether Maria broke the rules. It's about who gets to decide what the rules actually are. Right now, people who have legally lived in America for decades are packing their belongings, not because new laws were passed, but because the Trump administration has moved the line on what's legal. And when the government can move that line, the law becomes something else entirely, a tool of power rather than a shield of rights. This isn't a story about breaking the law, it's a story about moving it. To understand how, we need to look back 100 years to when another administration did exactly the same thing. To understand what's happening now, we need to go back to 1919. America had just finished World War I, Russia had just had its revolution, and in the United States there was panic. Communists, it seemed, were everywhere. They were hiding in cities, they were organizing workers, they were a threat to the nation itself. At least that's what people believed. Enter Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. He was a politician who understood something fundamental about power. Fear is a tool, and if you control the threat, you control the response. Palmer declared war on communism. He didn't go through courts, he didn't build careful cases. He simply declared that communists and anyone suspected of communist sympathies were enemies of the state and had to be removed. Assisting him was a young FBI agent named J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover's job was simple: make lists, lists of suspects, lists of immigrants, lists of people to arrest. Then came the night of January 2, 1920. In a single coordinated action across 33 American cities, federal agents burst into homes, union halls, and meeting places. They didn't have warrants for most of the people they arrested. They didn't need to. Palmer had declared these people threats to national security, and that was enough. By morning, over 10,000 people had been arrested. Most of them weren't communists. Most were immigrants, most were workers, most were just living their lives, but they fit the profile Palmer had created, and that was all that mattered. 500 were eventually deported. The others were released when authorities couldn't actually prove they'd done anything wrong. But the damage was done. The message was sent. If the government wants you gone, being innocent doesn't save you. Palmer called it a success. He called it protecting America. He called it following the law. Now fast forward to 2025. The Trump administration launches what it calls the largest deportation operation in American history. On the surface, this makes sense. Immigration law exists. Illegal immigration is real. Surely the government should enforce its laws. But look closer at who's actually being deported. In February 2026, a woman named Jessica was arrested by ICE agents. She had a valid work visa, she was working legally, she was paying taxes. She had a green card application pending. By every practical measure, she was in the legal process of becoming a permanent resident. But she also had something in her file, a minor paperwork issue from when she first entered the country 15 years ago. A technicality, something that would have been routine to fix if anyone had bothered to address it. Instead, she was deported. Similar stories multiply. A man who arrived as a child granted asylum by a court suddenly deemed deportable. A woman with a green card for 12 years who suddenly learned her status could be revoked because of a discrepancy in her original filing. A family that had been living under a deferral of removal for 7 years, a legal status that meant they were allowed to stay, suddenly told the deferral was canceled and they had to go. The Trump administration expanded the definition of who could be deported: people with visas, people with green cards, people with pending asylum claims, people with legal deferrals that had been approved by previous administrations. It's as if a sports league suddenly decided that plays that were legal last season are illegal this season. The rulebook didn't change. The referees just moved the line. One immigration attorney described it this way: "We're seeing people arrested who technically did nothing different than they were doing yesterday. But yesterday's legal is today's illegal." Here's where it gets stranger. Many of the people being deported aren't new cases. They're old cases, and by that I mean very old cases. Some had received deportation orders years, even decades ago, but those orders were stayed, they were deferred. They were put on hold. Under the Obama and Biden administrations, enforcement priorities focused on people who posed security threats or had serious criminal records. So people like Maria, who had lived lawfully and worked for 30 years, kept their deferrals. That's not breaking the law, that's how the law actually works. Immigration law, by design, gives the executive branch discretion. The president gets to decide who to prioritize for deportation. Some administrations prioritize violent criminals, some focus on recent border crossers. The law itself is flexible. But that flexibility cuts both ways. When Trump returned to office, he didn't pass new laws, he simply decided to enforce the old ones differently. He canceled deferrals that had been approved years earlier. He reactivated old deportation orders. He expanded who counted as an enforcement priority. Same law, different discretion, different result. A man who had a deferral since 2015 suddenly faced deportation in 2025. He hadn't done anything new, nothing had changed about his situation. What changed was who was making the decisions. It's like discovering that a speed limit sign has been on the same road for 40 years, nobody enforced it, everyone drove past it, but then a new police chief arrives. He decides to enforce every ticket going back decades. Suddenly, people who have been driving the same way for 40 years are criminals. Same road, same sign, same speed, but now they're being punished for it. Here's the uncomfortable truth that ties all of this together. The Trump administration didn't break the law, they moved it, and the reason they could move it is because the law was designed to let them. Immigration law is fundamentally different from other areas of law. It grants the executive branch enormous discretion. The president gets to decide enforcement priorities. The president gets to decide who stays and who goes. There are no hard rules, there's no requirement to deport anyone, there's only a grant of power. This is by design. Presidents need flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, but that same flexibility means the law depends entirely on who's wielding it. Think about what that means. If the next president decides to reverse course, they can do it with a pen stroke. If the president after that wants to enforce differently again, they can. The law itself remains unchanged, but its meaning changes every 4 years or every time power transfers. One immigration attorney put it starkly: the law isn't protecting people anymore, it's protecting the government's right to change its mind. Some people challenge the deportations in court, but deportation moves fast. Court cases move slow. By the time a judge could review the case, the person was already gone. There's a gap between how long legal processes take and how quickly the government can act. That gap is where power lies. In 1920, Palmer claimed the Anarchist Exclusion Act authorized his mass deportations. Technically, it did. He was following the law. But he was following the law in a way it had never been followed before. He was following the law in a way that changed what the law meant. The courts eventually pushed back. A lawyer named Louis Post, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, reviewed Palmer's cases. He found that most of the arrests were illegal. Most didn't have proper warrants. Most didn't have real evidence. Post invalidated nearly all of them, but by then the damage was done. The precedent was set. The government had shown what was possible. 100 years later, we're seeing the same pattern repeat. So let's return to where we started. Maria followed the law. She lived here for 34 years. She paid her taxes. She worked. She built a life. And then one day, she was deported because of a paperwork issue from 1992. Officials said she broke the law, but she also said she followed it. How can both things be true? The answer is that the law changed without changing. The rules stayed the same, but who was enforcing them and how they were enforcing them shifted completely. This is what happens when power gets concentrated in one person's hands, when discretion becomes the rule instead of the exception, when the government can decide retroactively what counts as legal and what counts as illegal. The Trump administration didn't break the law, they demonstrated something more troubling. They showed that the law itself can be whatever the person in power decides it is. In 1920, Palmer called it protecting America. In 2026, it's called enforcement, but the mechanism is identical. Expand the definition, activate old orders, move the line. And once you move the line, it can always be moved again. The uncomfortable question we have to ask ourselves is not whether Trump followed the law. He did, but the question is whether a system that gives one person the power to move the line on legality is a system of law at all. Or whether it's just a system of power wearing a law's mask. Because here's what history teaches us. The line never stops moving, it just keeps shifting. And the people who believed they were safe find out too late that safety was always just an illusion. Maria thought she was safe. She had 34 years of proof that she belonged, but none of that mattered when the line moved. And if it can move for her, it can move for anyone.